Good afternoon again, and welcome to the 82nd Historia Medical Lecture here at Becker Medical Library. This lecture is actually paired with our gallery exhibit, so this is our yearly gallery exhibit lecture as well. Today, the lecture's title is Dissecting the Past, Doctors, Donors, and Assembling a Collection. The speaker will be Elisabeth Brander, our very own director of our Center for the History of Medicine and head of rare books here at Becker Medical Library. She will no doubt give a wonderful talk. She's given great talks in the past on subjects ranging from Hannibal Lecter as a book collector and to medicine in the Game of Thrones, so I suspect that this one will be as engaging and interesting as her others have been. She and her colleagues have also put together a wonderful Glaser Gallery exhibit on the 7th floor of Bernard Becker Medical Library called Out of Scope, and that explores the most unexpected items in our rare book collections. There will be time after Elisabeth's lecture for questions, so please use Zoom's Q&A feature to post your questions anytime, and we will get to them at the end. So without any further ado, I am going to turn it over to Elisabeth.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And to my knowledge, none of the donors who gave their collections to the Becker were cannibals. I don't think any of them were, so we are not going to be talking about cannibalism today. Sorry if that disappoints anyone. But so welcome to the Rare Book Reading Room here at Becker Library. I'm admittedly a bit biased, but I do think that our rare book collections are probably one of the highlights of the medical library. And over here we have about 20,000 volumes in 9 separate collections. And so some of our collection strengths are things like ophthalmology, neurology, anatomy, obstetrics and gynecology, and they cover a huge span of time. The oldest book is actually from 1477, which is a German surgical text, and then they go all the way up to the mid-20th century. But the thing about rare book collections, whether they're here at the Becker or they're at the National Library of Medicine or pretty much anywhere, is that they don't just kind of appear. They don't just suddenly appear out of nowhere. They're the results of decisions made by people. The private collectors who purchase the books in the first place and then will eventually give those to libraries. And then later on, it's the institutions, the institutional curators and librarians who continue to shape those collections. And so we're kind of actually going to start out by just talking a little bit about rare books as a concept. And so there's not really a hard and fast definition for what a rare book is, and one person's idea of a rare book might actually be different from someone else's. But there are some metrics that you usually seem to see thrown around a lot, and those are often things like age, how old is a book, scarcity, how many copies exist, and do they have like anything that distinguishes it? Maybe they have a lot of beautiful illustrations, or previous owners have left a lot of notes in the margins. But really the key thing about rare books that we need to bear in mind is that a book doesn't just automatically become a rare book in a rare book collection. It's really very much kind of a product of the society that produces it. And it's really closely tied in with ownership. Who has owned this book? So who purchased the book, and then why did they decide to keep that book? I know I certainly don't keep all of the books that I bought. So basically someone at some point bought this book and decided it was important enough to keep, often for centuries. And then kind of going hand in hand with these owners are also the people who are selling the books, like booksellers, who in the early modern period, we can see them starting to develop catalogs and bibliographies to kind of promote their stock and also to help provide guidance on what are these sort of distinguishing characteristics that a savvy collector might want to look out for as they start building their collection. Another thing is that rare books are also really closely tied to this idea of cultural heritage. And so a lot of the earliest printed books, often incunabula, which are those books printed prior to 1501, start to be seen as part of this civilized inheritance, kind of like antiquities or ancient manuscripts. And so then there's this idea that these are something that we need to hand down to future generations. And so you have this need to identify what are the most important texts that need to be preserved and handed down? And so kind of one interesting thing that happens here is that you start to develop these hierarchies of books. So for instance, you'll have the incunables or the editio princeps, the very first printed editions of certain titles, really early editions of the Bible. These are kind of your top level books that people look at and they know we need to keep this. This is important for future generations to have. And then you kind of start to go further down into kind of the slush piles of things like pop literature, pamphlets, broadsheets. And all of these are kind of seen as the waste paper and the scrap. And so those are actually usually tossed out and are lost and are actually now some of the most interesting things that researchers want to use. And so that kind of hints that just because a book is scarce doesn't necessarily mean that it's rare, and kind of vice versa. And one thing too that this means is that there's a certain kind of homogeneity in which books have been preserved in libraries, because it's been this series of decisions of people looking at what is important and kind of coming to a social consensus of what that is. And so in terms of medical books, there's actually one very, very famous book that kind of shows how all of these factors come together. And that is one that a lot of you probably know of and have seen maybe even here at the Becker. And that is Andreas Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica. And Carter, if you want to go to the book cam. So this is one of two first editions that we have here at the Becker Medical Library. And so this was written by the Flemish anatomist Andreas Vesalius and printed by Johannes Operinus, who was one of the most important printers within this network of humanist printers in Basel, Switzerland in the 16th century. And so this is really seen as one of the seminal works in the history of anatomy. And there are kind of two really key reasons for that. And one is that this is seen as the first really systematic correction of a lot of the classical anatomy that had been handed down from Galen, which had a lot of factual errors mixed into it. And another reason that it's so well regarded is that it is visually spectacular. The most famous image is probably going to be the frontispiece, but it actually has about 200 woodcut illustrations in it. And nothing had been done on quite the scale before in medical books. So like a book with this amount of illustrations was unprecedented, and it made basically an immediate impact. But it was not always considered a rare book. It was always an expensive book because it is very, very large. It's a folio edition. And so that would have automatically made it expensive to purchase. But it wasn't just kind of a prestige coffee table book. And a few years ago, a group of historians actually did a survey of all of the copies of the 1543 and 1555 editions of the Fabrica that they could track down. And they noticed that these books were used pretty extensively by the physicians who owned them. They noticed that annotators were writing in the margins about here's what Galen says and here's what Hippocrates says. They were writing about what Vesalius's contemporaries said. And they were also really engaging with the text, not even necessarily the illustrations. So this was a practical work. This was something that the anatomists of the time would really use. They didn't just kind of set it into their library as kind of a prestige book to show how learned or how wealthy they were. But then, of course, this starts to change. And there are sort of a couple of key factors that push the Fabrica out of being an expensive but useful text into being more of a rare book. And so the two main factors are there are changes in medical practice. And then we also see the rise of book collecting among North American physicians in particular. And so in the late 18th century, you start to see a decline in the price of the Fabrica. And this actually continues all the way through the 19th century as well. For instance, this group of historians actually found out that at one point you could buy a first edition copy of Darwin's The Origin of Species for cheaper than a 1555 edition of the Fabrica. And so, I mean, this is when The Origin of Species first came out. So this isn't a case of, now, of course, that is a tremendously expensive book, but this would have been right when it came out. And one of the reasons for this price drop is that the Fabrica is no longer a useful text. The practice of medicine has changed. You see things like histology and comparative anatomy becoming more important. Also, colored anatomical atlases are rising in prominence as well. So the older texts like Vesalius that are, these black and white woodcuts and that are really relying on older traditions of anatomy, they are kind of becoming a part of medical history. They're no longer going to be part of a working medical library. And then in hand with that, we also have the rise of our physician collectors. And these are the ones who basically really established the cult of Vesalius and made Vesalius the kind of item that you would need to have in your library. And so in the late 19th century in particular, a lot of American physicians would spend a year or two training in Europe, traveling in Europe. And so while they were there, they could acquire the start of a rare book collection, and sometimes they would pick up copies of the Fabrica. And two of the key figures here are William Osler and Harvey Cushing. I'm sure a lot of you are very, very familiar with those names. They are very prominent within the history of medicine. Osler was one of the big four at Johns Hopkins, and then of course Harvey Cushing is part of Yale. Yale University has his collection now. And so Osler in particular loved Vesalius. At one point, he actually owned 7 copies of the 1543 edition, and he also had 2 copies of the 1555 edition. And one thing that he did that's really interesting is that he would strategically donate these to North American medical libraries. Because, and this is a quote of his, "We cannot have too many copies in America, and no medical library is complete without one." And so actually, I think the University of Missouri, Mizzou, they actually have a 1555 edition that was one of Osler's that he gave to them to, spread Vesalius throughout North America. And so even though Vesalius, it's not really a particularly scarce book, there are lots of books that fewer copies of it exist, but there's kind of this huge cult of Vesalius that was driven by a lot of these early North American collectors. And that's really helped to make this a centerpiece in so many history of medicine collections. And so if we look at the Becker in particular, we can also see how these ideas also shaped the collections here. And so I'm going to talk a little bit just about the history of the medical library. And so the very first time that Washington University's medical department even mentions a library is in the 1902-1903 annual announcement. And so this is when they say we're going to have a library, and it's going to be funded by revenue generated by the Cooperative Association. And that is what allowed students to purchase books, stationery, and other supplies for their membership fee. And the very first medical library was actually housed in what had been the dental department at the St. Louis Medical College on Locust Street. And that is a photo of that building, which I believe no longer exists. And so then in 1910, the medical library basically gets a windfall. They get $15,000 to support the library. They get adequate space, and they have the promise for an annual budget. And so now they start to think about what is the strategic plan going to be for the library's future. And so I'm just going to read out from it because it talks specifically about rare books and where it fit into that plan. And so in this first kind of strategic plan for the library, they say that they want the assembling, accessioning, and classification of the material acquisition of the textbooks, monographs, systems, encyclopedias, handbooks, yearbooks, and reports, biographic, bibliographic, and historical works, subscriptions and periodicals most needed for all lines of medical research and for the instruction of undergraduates and the completion of all series. We formally decided not to make any effort at building a book museum, nor buy antiques out of the budget, but to aim at getting through gift items that formed landmarks in the history of medicine. So the focus here is on a working library. They're not really looking to establish any kind of special collections division or collection of rare medical texts. They know that it would be nice to have them, but they don't want to specifically go out and buy them using the money that could be, in their opinion, better spent elsewhere. And so then in 1912, they basically get the chance to actually start building a rare book collection. And so that is when this gentleman passes away. This is Julius Pagel, and he was a German medical historian and bibliophile. And after his death, his collection went up for sale. And so Pagel was born in Germany, and he received his medical degree from the University of Berlin in 1876. But his real passion was actually the history of medicine more so than the practice of medicine. And he developed a book collection of about 2,500 volumes. And so this included a number of what we would consider probably standard rare books, monographs printed prior to 1600s by kind of all of the big names like Dioscorides or Avicenna, and also had a number of 17th and 18th century works as well. And one thing about Pagel is that these were not just trophy items on his shelves. So Pagel had this really strong passion for medical history. And so that meant that he would actively use these texts a lot. And so at one point in 1902, an American physician, M.G. Selig, went over to Germany and he persuaded Pagel to kind of give him a custom course on the history of medicine. And so on their very first meeting, which was about pre-Hippocratic medicine, he says that Pagel had laid out about 30 odd volumes in Arabic, Greek, Latin, and German. And he was so familiar with their contents that he never even needed to use an index. He could just open the books and find whatever he needed to find in 2 or 3 thumbings. And so Pagel is really using these books. They're part of his active library. And so at the time that Pagel dies and his book collection went up for sale, there were 2 members of the Washington University's Medical Library Committee who were really, really prominent bibliophiles, and those were George Dock and Frank J. Lutz. And so we're going to start by talking about George Dock. And so Dock was originally from the East Coast, and he received his medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania in 1884. And he came to Washington University in 1910, where he was both the dean of the medical school and the professor of medicine, and he eventually went out to California in 1922. And he was a really, really big supporter of medical libraries. He was actually president of the Medical Library Association from 1906 to 1909. And he was not only interested in the current medical literature, but he also really loved historical texts. And one kind of fun fact is that he was actually friends with William Osler, who we talked about previously. And so it's possible that Osler kind of might have encouraged this interest in him. And so, like Osler himself, Dock also assembled a collection of old medical texts. And most of his volumes eventually went to the Library of the Los Angeles County Medical Association, but he also gave several volumes to us here at WashU. And I actually want to show you one of them. So this is Conrad Gessner's Natural History Encyclopedia. And I just wanted to show you in the front here, here it says George Dock from his friend William Osler. So this is a copy that Osler had actually given to George Dock. And there we go. And then it contains a biographical note about Conrad Gessner. And this is actually a really cool book as well. It has, somewhere in here, a bunch of really, there we go, just really great woodcut illustrations of all these different animals in it. And so that is George Dock. And then also on the library committee, we have Frank J. Lutz. And so Lutz was a St. Louis man. He earned his medical degree from the St. Louis Medical College in 1876. And after he graduated, he taught surgery first at the college and then at the new Washington University Medical Department. And so like Dock, Lutz was very, very passionate about books, libraries, and history. And so he was a founding member of the St. Louis Medical Library, and he was also a member of the Missouri Historical Society. He was the chair of the St. Louis Medical History Club, which also no longer exists. And he was an avid collector of historical texts. And so actually in December of 1914, a number of his personal collection was loaned for an exhibit documenting the history of medicine that was held at the Jefferson Memorial, which is now the Missouri History Museum. And so this exhibit was co-sponsored by the Historical Society and the History Club, and it had a number of books from Lutz's personal collection, including this one here, which is John Sappington's Theory and Treatment of Fevers, which is credited for being the first medical book published west of the Mississippi River. And this one, unfortunately, doesn't have the actual Lutz book plate in it. So I'm just going to show it to you while we've got the camera. So that is actually the Frank J. Lutz book plate there. And so we have Frank Lutz and George Dock on the committee, and Pagel's collection has just gone up for sale. And they really, really want it, which is not a surprise. And so George Dock actually, at one point, he wrote an article specifically about the Pagel collection. And I just want to read this quote off to you because it's kind of interesting. So Dock tells us that it is not a collection of rare books as appeals to the dilettante. There are, however, incidentally, at least 2 incunabula, a good many interesting autographs, and a few ex libris. It is conspicuously the collection of an enthusiastic but frugal student and teacher of medical history, including the historical relations of medicine to human society, and so it contains many works for and essential to the working and reference library of a medical school, and is complete enough and varied enough to form a valuable, even imposing, nucleus for a medical historical seminar or institute. And there are kind of a couple things about this statement that I think are interesting. And the main thing is that Dock isn't just viewing this collection as important or valuable because it has some historical texts in it. He knows that they're there and he appreciates them, but he is really talking about this as a library as a whole that can be used and that can be useful for the medical students. He's not just saying this is a rare book collection that will kind of be prestigious on our shelves. He's kind of, he says the incunables are incidental. They're not really the focus of his attention here. And so the issue is that we still have this caveat that the library doesn't want to use funds to buy a rare book collection. And this was a pretty large purchase. It was 16,000 German marks at the turn of the 20th century. And so in this case, they needed to get help from an outside source. And so in this case, Dr. W.E. Fischel was kind of the key figure. He was another member of the library committee who was a bibliophile, and he was friends with Christine Blair Graham, who was a noted St. Louis philanthropist. She was the widow of Benjamin Brown Graham, who was the president of the Graham Paper Company. And so kind of the monument that she would be known for the most is Graham Chapel over on the Danforth campus, which she actually dedicated to the memory of Benjamin Brown Graham. But for us here at the medical school, her contribution is probably more the acquisition of the Pagel collection. And so on a number of our books, you can actually see, this is the standard book plate that we see in a lot of our classics of medicine collection. It says, from the library of Professor Julius Pagel, the gift of Mrs. Benjamin Brown Graham through Dr. W.E. Fischel. So that kind of let them get around this loophole. They were able to find someone to basically buy the books for them. And so the Pagel purchase is really the library's main rare book acquisition for a pretty long time. It did acquire Lutz's collection after he died in 1916, and they kind of acquired a few books here and there over the next several years. But what really sort of drove them to create a special collections division happens in the mid-1970s, and that's when they get 2 major donations. And so the first of these was the collection of Dr. Bernard Becker. Of course, that is where we get the name of this entire medical library. And he was the head of Washington University's Department of Ophthalmology and Visual Sciences. And Dr. Becker had a longstanding interest in books. And so when he traveled, he would often purchase these interesting items from old bookstores, and then he would have them shipped home. And so these purchases were supplemented with gifts from his father-in-law, who was interested in what he called collector's items. And he eventually amassed a collection of about 600 volumes. And so in the introduction to the Becker catalog, which describes his collection, he stated that, as the collection grew, I began to feel rather selfish about the possession of these rare and sometimes unique books, and developed the need to share the experiences they offered with others. It has always been my firm conviction that books, like ideas, do not belong to individuals. They must be available to everyone. And so this spirit of generosity led him to donate the collection to the library in 1975. And it was the library's largest acquisition of rare books since the Pagel collection. And so there you can actually see the Beckers with the gift. The woman on the far right is Estelle Broadman, who was the librarian here at the Becker at the time. And she is a very, very influential figure actually in the history of medical bibliography. And so the second major donation that happens in the 1970s is the gift of the CID collection, the Max A. Goldstein Collection in Speech and Hearing. And so this collection was assembled by Max Aaron Goldstein, that gentleman there. And he was a St. Louis native who graduated from the Missouri Medical College in 1892. So that's the other forerunner institution of WashU. And so like a lot of the other physicians during this time period, he spent 2 years training in Europe at the Vienna Polyclinic, where he was studying with Adam Politzer, who was a prominent otologist. And then back in St. Louis, he founded the Central Institute for the Deaf in 1914, which was an institution where teachers and otologists could collaborate on deaf education. And so Goldstein was like the quintessential passionate rare book collector. And he assembled his collection between about 1922 and 1939. And he developed this collection of several hundred volumes that date from the 16th through the 19th centuries. And so one of the cool things about him is that we actually still have a lot of his documentation regarding the purchases of his rare books in the archives. So for instance, this is the folder related to the Meggs brothers. And we can see that he maintained an active relationship with a lot of booksellers in both Europe and North America. He was in correspondence with Meggs Bros, which is a very prominent London book firm. I think I've actually bought from them too. And he was also in contact with Wilfrid Voynich. He was a very renowned antiquarian bookseller, most famous for the Voynich manuscript, which is this very mysterious manuscript that people love to try and decode. And one of my favorite parts about Goldstein is that he was willing to negotiate with these people. He was not a passive collector. He would really go after what he wanted. So for instance, in 1914, at one point, Voynich had offered Goldstein a 16th century Italian text for $20. And Voynich or Goldstein sent a reply saying, well, I got a quote from another bookseller saying that it's $15. So you should match that. I will take it from you for 15. And then Voynich kind of snarkily said, well, my binding is really good, so 20 is fair. But eventually they settled for like a less nice copy for $15. So they were both happy. And that collection came over to Becker in 1977. And then there's a picture of the ceremony in which the Goldstein collection came over. At that time, it was not in this space, it was in the library annex. And so then in the 80s, 3 more collections come over, and those are coming from the St. Louis Medical Society, which closed its library in 1989. And so we have their general rare books, the James Moore's Ball collection, and the Robert E. Schluter Paracelsus collection. And so James Moore's Ball was an ophthalmologist who actually began his career at the Keokuk Medical College in Iowa. And then he moved to St. Louis, where he served as the professor and chair of ophthalmology and otology at the St. Louis College of Physicians and Surgeons. And so like all of our other collectors, he has this really strong interest in the history of medicine, and he published on a lot of historical topics. So he wrote articles on things like classical medicine, the famous physicians of the preceding centuries, Arabic medicine, pretty much a little bit of everything. But his real passion is the history of anatomy, especially Vesalius. And so he actually wrote one of the first biographies that we have of Vesalius. And he was also a collector. So he curated a personal collection of materials related to ophthalmology. And these were mostly visual media like photographs and drawings. And he donated those to the Army Medical Museum in 1922. Their curator, Major George Callender, actually requested them. But his real legacy is probably the book collection. And so that is about 400 volumes. They cover the period from the very early 1500s to the early 20th century. And one thing about him that's kind of interesting is that he's an ophthalmologist like George Becker, but unlike Becker, he's not really collecting in the history of his specialty. The Becker collection is really, really focused on ophthalmology. Ball was a little bit more of a generalist. His collection has sort of a lot of the standard history of medicine texts, things like Galen or Hippocrates, but it's also anatomy is probably its single biggest strength. So it has a number of the major Renaissance anatomical atlases. So there's a Vesalius first edition in there, the really big Albinus Atlas that has Clara the rhinoceros in it, another one of those famous history of medicine images. And so he's really going more for anatomy than the history of his specialty. And so then the other big collector coming out of the St. Louis Medical Society was Robert Schluter. And so Schluter graduated from the St. Louis College of Pharmacy in 1891 and the Missouri Medical College in 1895. And he looks deeply unhappy in every picture I've ever seen of him. I don't think he was a very pleasant man. But like James Moore's Ball, Schluter was very, very passionate about the history of medicine. And so in 1916, he actually published an essay in the Journal of the Missouri State Medical Association that argued for the importance of medical history to the profession. And in it, he said that for the medical man, there is no better training than the knowledge of his art. There is no doubt that only he who is interested in the history of a subject is sincerely interested in the subject itself. On the other hand, only he who is acquainted with the past can always know how to appreciate the deeds of the present. And so Schluter really, really lived by this ideal. Like Ball, he published a lot of articles on the history of medicine, things like physician biographies. He wrote about William Beaumont. Also, he would write about themes on medical art or medical themes in art and architecture. And he was really, really instrumental in founding the library of the St. Louis Medical Society. And he was also a rare book collector himself. And so while people like Ball or Becker were kind of interested in either the history of their specialty or sort of general history of medicine, Schluter was really interested in one person in particular. He had a fascination with Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, who is more commonly known as Paracelsus. And Paracelsus is kind of this really interesting iconoclastic figure. He was a physician, but he was also an alchemist and published a lot of prophecies and prognostications as well. That book that you see on the camera is actually one of his prophetic works. And so Schluter collected not only the works by Paracelsus, but also works by the followers of Paracelsus, reprints, other related texts. And so together they make this really comprehensive view of 16th century life, not only medical practices, but things like folk beliefs and superstition and philosophy. And so as for what about Paracelsus really intrigued Robert Schluter is kind of hard to know. Schluter was a surgeon, and we know that Paracelsus's major work was the Great Wound Surgery, but he's really more associated with his chemical remedies. So maybe there was some interest that Schluter had from when he graduated from the College of Pharmacy. But we know that Schluter also traveled through Europe in 1909 and 1910. And so possibly he started purchasing Paracelsus texts at that point in time. In his autobiography, he does specifically mention stopping at Salzburg so that they could see the grave of Paracelsus at the Church of St. Sebastian. So it seems like the interest was there at that time, but we don't quite know just what it was about Paracelsus that called to him. My personal unsubstantiated theory is that Schluter just looks like he would enjoy Paracelsus, because Paracelsus was also this very combative kind of feisty figure who was constantly getting run out of town. So they look like maybe they found a kindred soul in one another. That is just my wild guess. And so the final major collection collector that we're going to talk about today is H. Richard Tyler. And so he was a Washington University alumnus who went on to teach at Harvard Medical School. And so in an oral history that he did with the American Academy of Neurology, he says that he had worked with a physician when he was an intern at Brigham, and that physician was the one who really gave him the collecting bug. And so that particular physician was interested in medical memorabilia, but Tyler decided that he was going to go after books, and he was specifically going to go after the history of neurology. And so he says exactly why he wanted to do this. He says that the book dealers knew what was important in books and what the price of books were and what was rare, but they didn't know necessarily all the people who were important. So there was a chance of doing something. So Tyler was being pretty kind of savvy in terms of what he wanted to collect. He knew that there was basically a place where he could assemble a very strong collection. So for instance, now if you wanted to collect Shakespeare, you would have a really hard time doing that because you will never have a collection better than the Folger Shakespeare libraries ever. But at this time, he knew no one was collecting neurology, so that was an area where he could really build a fantastic comprehensive collection. And so he eventually got so many books that they were taking over his entire house. He would occasionally buy duplicates of books because he didn't realize that he already had a copy in a closet somewhere, which kind of gives you an idea of how large this collection was. And so actually, like Julius Pagel before him, Tyler loved to share his works with others. And so he liked to invite residents to history sessions where he would display his books for them and kind of give them the chance to go through things like Charcot or Thomas Willis. And he would also bring them to meetings for the American Academy of Neurology. So he was big in bringing the books to the masses. And actually in that same oral history, he said that as much as possible, I want people to get their hands dirty, bring the books to meetings, sign them out. We do not sign them out, but we are always happy for people to come in and look at the books here. And so one thing too about Tyler that's kind of interesting is that he also was aware of the fact that rare books can be a legacy item as well. And so he actually says in the same oral history that I was not oblivious to the fact that Cushing's major contribution was the donation of his books to Yale, and the Yale Rare Book Library has Cushing's collection and it will stand the test of time. They know he was the father of neurosurgery, but they will never forget the fact that if you want to see Vesalius, you will have to go to Cushing's collection. So from this point of view, you know, rare books are something that he was assembling out of personal interest and enjoyment, but he's also kind of thinking of them in terms of this is what I will pass on. This will kind of be my legacy in the future to the history of medicine. So at this point, we kind of have a pretty good picture of the various collectors that contributed to the collections here at Becker. And one thing that I think is kind of interesting is that when you take kind of a very broad look at it, all of our collectors are fairly homogeneous. So all of them are male doctors of European descent. They were all highly educated, and they also had enough money that they could amass these very large collections of expensive texts. Sometimes they could even go to Europe and buy the texts there. And so these same kinds of similarities are reflected in the collections that they assembled. And so if you think back to kind of what I mentioned about homogeneity way back at the beginning, you can see that here. You can see places where these collections are overlapping. So for example, if you look at the Ball collection and the Tyler collection, they both have copies of Vesalius. They both have copies of Juan Valverde's anatomical atlases. And by the same token, the Becker collection and the Ball collection both have copies of Georg Bartisch's ophthalmology text from 1583. So you can see, or like figures like Galen and Hippocrates, the early editions there are scattered throughout the collections because that is kind of what society has decided is important for a medical history collection to have. And so even though sometimes you'll see that these collectors are focusing on their specific area, of practice. They're also pretty much telling the story of the development of medicine in Europe and North America from the 1400s onwards. And the texts that represent other traditions are pretty few and far between. Kind of the one major exception to this would be the Arabic physicians, especially Avicenna, because Avicenna was the route by which Galen and Hippocrates were preserved in Europe in the early modern period. But even there, you can see most of the time you'll get Latin editions of Avicenna, like this one here. And so this isn't just the case with Becker Library. It's a pretty common story in North American libraries in general. We kind of have this story that Hippocrates and Galen are the wellspring of medical knowledge. Then Vesalius revolutionizes anatomy, William Harvey crushes Galenism, and kind of so forth and so on. And so there is, absolutely nothing wrong with having an interest in and wanting to collect the materials that will reflect the academic and medical heritage that you are trained in. I mean, it's perfectly understandable that Becker went for the classics of ophthalmology and Tyler focused on neurology and so on. And there are a lot of other factors at play here as well. One of them is the availability of books. So during the interwar period, when a lot of these physicians were buying their collections, the stock that they had access to was going to be mostly coming from institutions that were trying to raise money. And so those are going to mostly be European. Also, doctors like Schluter or Goldstein, they definitely spoke English and German, probably had a background in Latin and Greek as well. Kind of any sort of non-Western languages they might not have had as much of a background in. So it's kind of natural that they're going to gravitate towards the texts that they can engage with more deeply. But one thing that happens is that once you give your personal collection to an institution, they become part of a broader mission. And so the goals and collection policies of an institution aren't necessarily going to be an exact reflection of the collector's goals. And in the past several years, a lot of special collections departments in particular have been re-examining sort of their collections and policies with the aim of making them more diverse and inclusive, because of course our campuses are also very diverse and inclusive places with people coming from all over the world. And another thing about special collections in particular is that they are places of power. And so the items that are in them have kind of this privileged position within the libraries. So, they're not in the open stacks where anyone can go and browse them. They're kept in secure areas. You have to file a request to see them. You'll have to check your bags. There are all of these steps that you go through. And they're there for a reason. We want to keep these collections safe. But they're also sending this message that these are the texts that are important. They are the ones that are sort of most worthy. They're also in places like this. You can't see the entirety of the reading room behind me, but a lot of special collections architecture kind of evokes this European idea of the gentleman's ideal study. So you kind of have a confluence of various factors that are kind of focusing on the importance of the Western bibliographic tradition. And so now a lot of special collections places are kind of looking at reevaluating that. And so kind of what do libraries do with this? We know in the history of medicine, of course, that the European tradition is not the only tradition. And also we know that the history of medicine is very international by its nature. We know that medical ideas have always traveled across the globe. Like for the case of Avicenna, we know that Greco-Roman ideas went to the Arabian Peninsula and back. We know that, for instance, the Dutch traders learned about acupuncture when they were at the island of Dejima in Nagasaki. And then in turn, the Japanese physicians learned about Western anatomy, or we can see how materia medica travels around the world and is incorporated into all of these different botanical texts. We also know that libraries are often dealing with budget and space constraints. So kind of what do you do? And it's not something that is an easy or overnight fix, but it's something that requires ongoing commitment. Personally, I think that a good place to start is that you can begin by kind of following these medical connections. So for instance, here we have the Becker collection, which is one of the most comprehensive collections of historical ophthalmological texts. And so for us, this has been a really good starting point. I have like a whole pile of books here now. So for instance, this is the Bartisch, which is Dunk, kind of one of the most famous European early modern German ophthalmology texts. And so because we already have so many of the European texts, it makes it a good starting point for us to expand our collections in other directions as well. So for instance, now we're kind of pivoting and focusing more on East Asian ophthalmology texts because it complements our existing holdings, but it's also kind of pushing us into a new direction. So this is actually a 17th century Chinese ophthalmology text. And so, like I said, this is basically an ongoing process. It's not something that you can just fix overnight, but kind of the goal is that you start with these steps and hopefully we can lay the groundwork that will let our collections reflect a global history of medicine rather than just the Western tradition. And so that's what I've got for you guys. Do we have questions?
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. People, you can put questions in the Q&A.
I have a whole pile in front of me.
So I'll ask a question. Oh, here we go. We have a question. I'll read it out to you. The early collection development seems to rely heavily on donors. Do you still rely heavily on donors, or are you able to buy books?
It's a combination of both. I mean, I think the vast majority of libraries always wish that their budget was about 100 times larger than it is. We do have an acquisitions budget and we are able to buy books. So I've kind of been focusing the books that I buy kind of more in the non-Western medical areas. We also do rely heavily on donors as well. I can't remember, sometime before the pandemic, I no longer have any sense of time, but we actually did get a pretty decent collection of a couple hundred books coming in, mostly related to the history of psychology. So we are always looking for donors. We love our donors and we greatly appreciate them. So we're also kind of using a strategy of both to help build our collections.
Thank you. Next question is, what's your favorite rare book in the collection?
I don't know. It changes. I don't know. It changes a lot. If I had to pull one off the top of my head, I really like John French's Distillation Manual from the 1600s because it has recipes for making elixirs out of human brains and stuff like that. And I think that that is a lot of fun.
Here is an interesting question. How do you balance working on a more diverse collection with concerns about taking historical documents from the cultures or countries they came from?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So last summer, I actually took a class on the history of the book in China. And one thing that we talked about this too. And one thing about books in particular is that books are a commercial product. They are made to be sold and disseminated. There can definitely be complications with that, especially we've seen from World War II when the Nazis pillaged a lot of these libraries, and now people are trying to reunite these libraries with their rightful owners. But if you are, for the most part, if you are working with reputable booksellers, in that case, I think that buying books is fine. Books are a commercial product. You would definitely not want to go into a place and take it without someone's permission. I mean, at this point, I personally have not really had to deal with that, fortunately. And I don't really necessarily want to give a grand overarching statement on it. But I think be careful who you're dealing with and where the material is coming from.
Do the books ever need to be rebound or repaired?
They do. So generally the current philosophy on conservation is be careful and don't do anything that you can't undo. So you want to stabilize the book so that it can be used, but you don't necessarily want to do a complete and total rebind unless it's basically your only option. So I'm looking to see if I have anything in front of me. That might be a good example, and I don't. But yes, basically, if we have books that we can no longer safely display for classes or in exhibits, those we would send out to have them stabilized, but we don't do anything really invasive.
And we have a comment here from Robert Feibel. Ball was very interested in body snatching and wrote a fine book on this subject in the 18th and 19th century Britain. He also related how Parliament finally regulated the source of bodies for anatomy. This was also an issue in 19th century America.
Yes, he wrote The Sack 'em Up Men. We have a couple of copies of that in our collections, and I know our archivists have done some work on body snatching issues here in St. Louis, especially in regards to McDowell, who is one of the Missouri Medical College professors. So there is definitely some history there.
Thank you, that was great. Do you know of any collections of medical ephemera, or if there are any book dealers, institutions, or individuals who are collecting in this area?
Medical ephemera. I can't think of sort of any major collections off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure that NLM has, or I think NLM has a collection of medical ephemera, but I'm not 100% certain. I do see collections of ephemera come through the book catalogs or the rare book catalogs from time to time as well. So there is a market out there, but it is not a huge one.
Is there a famous medical book that you don't have in the collection but wish you did?
Lots. One of the ones that I really wish we had is it's this 18th century French anatomical atlas by Gaudier d'Agati. It's done in full color mezzotint, and it's beautiful. And it's kind of the one major European anatomical atlas that we don't have that I desperately wish that we did. But it's always extremely expensive whenever I see it come up for sale. So maybe we will get a very wealthy donor sometime who will buy it. I also wish we had a copy of the Kaitai Shinsho, which is a Japanese Rangaku medical text. It was kind of the first medical text published in Japan dealing with Dutch anatomy. I would really like a copy of that.
Are there English translations of the text of the books?
Depends on the book. So for Vesalius, there are a couple of English translations. There's the Garrison Hast one is the most recent one, and we have a copy of that here. It is enormous. It is basically bigger than the original edition of Vesalius. I know that Georg Bartisch has an English translation as well. Also, you can find, I think, you can find translations of Galen and Hippocrates out there as well. I think there are translations of Paracelsus as well, although those seem to be of somewhat dubious quality at times. So it depends on the book. They're out there, but definitely not for everything.
Does the Becker Library collect anything other than books in the area of history of medicine?
We do. So I am in charge of the rare books, but we also have the archives division as well. And so the archives really collect the history of the Washington University School of Medicine, and their collections encompass the history of the Missouri Medical College and the St. Louis Medical College as well. So they are a fantastic source, especially if you're looking for St. Louis history, local history in the history of medicine. Those would be kind of our two main areas. We also actually do have another collection of Max Goldstein's. We have his collection of historic hearing devices, which is really our only major artifact collection. The two main ones would be the archives and the rare books.
Well, seeing that there are no more questions, thank you, Elisabeth, very much. Really interesting. And thank you to everyone who came today. Go see the exhibit up in our 7th floor. Unfortunately, you have to be a faculty, staff, or student of our institution right now to get in and see it. But hopefully that will change soon and you'll be able to see it. Thank you very much again, Beth, and everyone take care.